Hello.
Oh. Hello? Okay. Hi, everyone. Hello, hello. So much chatter today. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started shortly. Thank you to whoever's doing that. Thank you, Bridget. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sophia Scarpa, and this is...
And I'm Melissa Mulrooney, and we're co-chairs of the Programs Committee.
Welcome to our panel today on building transportation for women. We're so excited to see all of you guys here on this beautiful sunny day, and excited to hear the chatter. It's very energizing. So thank you for coming. We're going to get started soon, but before we do, one of the perks of being an executive partner of WTS means that you get to introduce panelists and speakers that we have. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Clint Ferguson from Gannett Fleming to introduce our panel.
Man, they handed me the mic and everything. I didn't think that was actually going to happen. But, thank you. My name is Clint Ferguson. I'm with Gannett Fleming. It's great to be here, and it's an honor to introduce this talented and distinguished panel today. So they told me to stay on script, so I'm going to do that. Our first panelist is Kim Stone. She served as a council member in Highland Park, Illinois since May of 2013. Prior to being councilwoman, Kim worked the Union of Concerned Scientists, Safer Pest Control Project, Great Lakes Protection Fund, and Environmental Law and Policy. And she currently serves as co-chair of Go Green Illinois. She's co-chair of the Transit Electrification Task Force of Climate Reality Project, Chicago Metro Chapter. That one's a long one. That's a good one. I think the longest I have is a co-founder of the NASBF, which is the National Association of Super Band Fans. It's now defunct, something that I created in high school, but this one has a lot more impact for our community. She's also a board member for Community Partners for Affordable Housing and a national advisory board member for the Union of Concerned Scientists. So welcome, Kim. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Vickie Barrett. She's a senior transportation planner with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. She's worked in sustainable multimodal transportation design and planning for 2 decades. Her current work is devoted to improving travel safety while expanding mobility for vulnerable road users in the Chicago region. Prior to her work at CMAP, she was a planning consultant with Charlier or Charlier? Charlier. Wasn't sure if we were in France or in America. Yeah, okay. Associates based in Boulder, Colorado, serving clients across the country and developing multimodal transportation plans, innovative policies, and comprehensive design guidance to improve mobility and livability. Our next panelist, Ruth Rosas, is a program manager at America Walks with over 10 years of active transportation advocacy work. Prior to joining America Walks, Ruth worked on issues at the intersection of public health and the built environment at Lurie Children's Hospital. Ruth was also in the Peace Corps and served as a community and youth development specialist in Fiji Islands. That's impressive. With the goal of creating healthy, sustainable communities free from systemic barriers, Ruth is committed to social change through collaboration and creativity. Welcome, Ruth. Finally, our last panelist is Audrey Wennink. She's a senior director with the Metropolitan Planning Council. She's worked on transportation planning and policy for over 20 years. Prior to MPC, she worked as a transportation planning consultant for Cambridge Systematics for more than a decade on transit, freight, and traffic safety projects across the U.S. She's a member of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning's Transportation Committee, as well as the advisory boards of WTS and Young Professionals in Transportation. So we have a wonderfully talented and distinguished board here today. So thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Clint. And we are all so happy to be here today to talk about building transportation systems that serve women. And I just wanted to give a little background about where this concept came from. I've been a member of WTS for about 20 years. And the purpose of WTS is to help women get into leadership roles in the transportation industry, to gain decision-making, power, leadership, control over resources. But I wanted to ask the question of this group and other professionals in this sector, are we really building a system that works for women? You know, how are we manifesting this in our jobs every day in terms of improving a system for ourselves and other women in society, in the United States and even the world? I know many of your engineering firms maybe even work internationally. So how are we making a system that serves us, given that we are now gaining leadership roles and gaining influence? How can we use that to build a better system that meets our lifestyle needs, is safe, and works for the lives that we live? So I'm very appreciative to the WTS board for jumping on board and wanting to have this conversation, and I'm really appreciative to the panel today who have some really great stories to tell, and we're just going to make it pretty informal. So one thing I wanted to do is just help you get into the zone and ask, so free up a hand, get ready to raise your hand, and ask you to think about, reflect your experience as a woman or as a man who has women in your family and your life, your experience using the transportation system. And I want you to think about how, raise your hand if you have not made a trip sometime because you're concerned about your safety. Seeing a lot of hands, probably the majority of the room. How many people have spent money on an Uber or Lyft because they didn't feel safe walking or on transit at night? Majority of the room. How many people have not made a trip by biking or walking because they didn't feel safe because there was no sidewalk or no bike lane? A lot of hands. Have you ever taken a longer trip because the safest route was longer? Seeing some nods and a lot of hands. And last question, has lack of accessibility forced you to take a longer route or a car rather than public transit? Seeing a lot of hands there. So just getting into that mindset. Now I want to share a few facts about women and their use of transportation. We don't do enough disaggregating of data to isolate women's experiences on transportation. It's sadly relatively new, but we need to do more of it, and we do have some information. For example, according to the World Economic Forum, worldwide, females comprise approximately 2/3 of public transportation users. And we know in the United States it's over half. Women are more often to travel with luggage and with a companion, whether that's a child or a family member. Women are more likely to take more complex trips, do trip chaining. We can talk in jargon a little bit here. Around the world, cities that do the best job of catering to the needs of women cyclists also have the highest level of cycling overall. So if you design your cycling network for women, you'll have a lot of women riding. And the US has among the lowest shares of female riders in the world, cyclists. Overall, 82% of the men aged 70 years or older are driving. But guess how many women aged 70 years or older are driving? Only 55%. So almost half of women over 70 aren't driving. How are they getting around? 73% of all women are caregivers. A lot of women have responsibilities of getting children to school. I think we're aware that the amount of children walking to school has gone down precipitously. In 1969, nearly half of children walked or biked to school in the United States. In 2009, only 13% of children did. so that the burden of transporting children to school often, not always, but often falls on women. Let's talk about traffic safety, which is a huge passion of many of us on this panel. In Illinois, nearly 1,300 people die on the roads every year. Over 1,000, 1,300 in the state. And traffic fatalities in Illinois have increased 27% in the past 3 years, with large increases amongst pedestrians and cyclists. Men are those who take the more risky actions. And we have this, in our data: speeding, driving while intoxicated. And when they get into crashes, women die also. Women are 73% more likely to be seriously injured in a frontal car crash than men. You may not know that the crash test dummies used in cars, there were no female versions of crash test dummies until maybe like last year. Like the entire time that cars have been on the road, they've only been testing for survival for men's bodies and weights. In Illinois, 30% more women are injured as passengers, and they're less likely to be the driver in vehicle crashes that result in injuries. 2 more points I want to make. Let's talk about climate change. According to CMAP's study of greenhouse gas emissions in the Chicago region, transportation, that just came out, transportation was the only sector to increase between 2010 and 2019. Buildings got better. Transportation did not. And that was because vehicle miles traveled increased. So there was a 2% increase in greenhouse gases and a 4% increase in vehicle miles traveled in just 9 years. According to the United Nations, women worldwide are more impacted by climate change. And then lastly, if we think about women of color, data from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey shows that 6% of white US households do not have a vehicle, but 23% of black households do not have a vehicle. So there's a reliance on cars, and designing a system for cars has major racial implications. So a lot of those statistics are pretty sobering and really underscore that women are facing the brunt of a lot of challenges in the transportation system. So the question is kind of how can all of us in our roles, in our jobs every day, be doing work that helps to change the system. So I'm so excited to be with this wonderful group of panelists, and I think we really want to have this be just a really personal conversation. And I love the stories that our panelists are going to tell you today, that I've heard some of them before, and I can't wait for them to tell them. But the first question I want to ask the panel is, why is this personal to you? Why do you care about transportation? Why do you work or advocate in this area? So why don't we start, we'll just go in order. Why don't we start with Vickie? Why is this personal? Why do you do this work?
So, oh good, it's on. Hi everybody, I'm really happy to be here. It's a deeply personal issue for me. I've been a professional in this field for a long time, and I have this professional and passion about the right to walk and bike, like the right to mobility that we all have. And I'm fighting for that in my daily life at my job, but I am also a mother and a daughter, and I am the typical sandwich generation right now where I am taking care of young people and I'm taking care of old people. And the stats that Audrey raised that mentioned, 73% of all caregivers are women. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a mother or a daughter, but the people taking care of children, the people taking care of older Americans, they are much more likely to be a woman. And that means that they are traveling with people who have different needs, they're traveling slower, they're carrying stuff. I think we all know that we carry a lot of stuff. And those all present really unique challenges and opportunities for us to serve women better. And that connectedness that women have to other people just informs the decisions we make. It informs our risk levels that we're willing to take with our travel options. And so for me, it's deeply personal. And I'm going to tell a quick story about what made it really personal for me is when my daughter was in 4th grade, I had the opportunity to live abroad in Germany for a year. And we didn't speak the language, and that was a real challenge for us as a family. But one of the classes that 4th graders are offered, every single student in Germany gets in 4th grade a class on how to travel safely. It is a rigorous class. It includes tests and workbooks and practical skills that they give to students on how to walk safely. What are the rules of the road? Who stops at this intersection in what order? And then how to ride a bike. And what are the rules of the road for bicyclists? This is 4th graders in Germany. And at the end of a practicum, they all receive something called a bicycle license from the local police department that says you have the skills and you've demonstrated those. And that was not just transformative for the children that were learning these skills, it was transformative for the parents' confidence in their children's ability. So that is an example of how connected, how giving mobility to other types of people actually improves mobility for women because it reduces the reliance on caregivers to travel and bring people around. So that's deeply personal for me.
Is it on? Okay. So I came to Chicago to go to UIC, and I remember getting my U-Pass for the very first time and being like, I can go anywhere with this for free? My mind was blown because I had grown up in a really small town, and you needed a car to get anywhere. There was no buses. And driving, having to drive everywhere was a huge burden on my family. When I was younger, I could walk to school because it was like a mile and a half. But when I got older, my high school was really far, and so we couldn't. So trying to figure that out was really difficult. And so when I came to Chicago, knowing that a city, you could connect everywhere through public transportation, walking, biking was really life-changing to me. And what I started to notice kind of in the transportation sector as I started to get into it, I was working with a graduate student that was working on a travel survey, and basically it was tracking people's modes of transportation based on who they were in Chicago, the urban area and then the suburbs. And it was interesting to hear people's stories about these things, and what I noticed was that a lot of people were not being paid attention to, right? A lot of people were invisibilized, and a lot of those people were people that I had a lot of things in common with, right? They were either people of color, single mother families, low income, and so that kind of really motivated me to get into this space because I didn't really see those stories reflected in what I was hearing, and I didn't hear some of these issues being talked about, how do we move beyond cars, right? And then taking into account these different intersecting things in people's lives. And then as I've gotten older, I've seen it improve, but I do think that there's a lot of barriers still and a lot of things that are not talked about. There's still spaces that I go into that people will say people don't walk there, people don't bike there, things like that, and we know that's not true. And I think those are the stories that motivate me to be in these spaces so that we can kind of, talk about the people that don't get paid attention to enough and have all these other barriers.
I come at this from a different perspective because I'm not a transportation engineer, transportation professional. I was a transportation advocate for as long as I can remember, trying to I have a vision of a way that I want the world to be. I want it to be cleaner, I want it to be healthier, I want to be able to get around places by biking, by walking, by transit. I think there are so many benefits to humans, to society, to community, and also to the environment from getting around that way rather than in individual cars. So I've been doing this work for a very long time, and ran for elected office in order to try and implement this vision, I guess. One of the things that makes it personal to me is I'll never forget when one of my children was an infant, trying to carry the infant, the diaper bag, and the stroller up the stairs to the L. There was no elevator, and there was nobody who was going to help me in any way. And that came, I guess, about a year after I had to get off the L when I was pregnant because nobody was going to give up a seat. And there was no way that I could stand 8 months pregnant as we came around all of those curves. And I was biking to work prior to that, till my husband said, you know, maybe that's not a good idea. And I drove to work a couple of times and decided that wasn't such a good idea, and worked from home. Luckily had a really flexible work situation where they were open to that, even though it was like the days of dial-up internet. We figured out how to make it work, but I want those things to not be requirements. I want people to be able to work where they need to go and do what they need to do. So that's why I do this work.
Thank you, everyone. And Kim, could I ask you just to tell a little bit quickly why you ran for trustee of Highland Park? What was one of the motivating factors?
There were two motivating factors. One was that I wanted to put a green roof on a portion of my house, and the city gave me no end of trouble. I was in touch with colleagues who worked at the Chicago Department of Environment about data from the green roof on City Hall and how well that worked, and I provided that data. This was not like a little bit of advocacy work. This was like heavy-duty research. But the other reason was because I was trying to get a complete streets policy passed in Highland Park, and I believe actually these two things happened at the same time, which is why I bring up the green roof, because I believe that one of our public works staff retaliated against me personally because of the green roof, and took it out on the complete streets policy. Got the two things mixed up. Happy to discuss that offline at some point. And so the complete streets policy took over 4 years to pass, and passed once I stepped aside and sort of was the puppet master, if you will, talking behind the scenes to others about how to advocate to make it happen. So it passed actually just months before I got elected. I had already chosen to run because I was so angry that it was taking so long.
Yeah, I love this story about Kim is not the only one, but one of the few that I've run into of trustees of suburban municipalities that have actually run for office because they want complete streets. There's a dynamic woman in Batavia who's done the same thing. And so this just goes to show when you can have women in leadership that want to change things, and particularly in transportation, like that's really what it's taking, I think. Yeah.
But we need more.
We need
up
more.
There,
so yeah, you could run for office as well as doing your job as a transportation engineer. Actually, not totally kidding about that. So we've touched on a number of things. We've touched on being parents, or being single, or being a caregiver of older people, or feeling safe in the world. From the questions we've talked about so far. What do you think, so let's talk a little bit about what are some of the biggest issues right now? What is not working right now for women in transportation? What are some of the biggest issues?
Well, there's a very large transit issue, and not just in our region, but nationally happening with the change in where people are working and what their travel patterns are. So transit use is down, and although some transit ridership has returned, it is returning at a much slower rate for women. And there are a lot of worries about public safety associated with lower ridership on trains, and we need to make sure that we remove all the barriers that people are experiencing like that. There are transit agencies talking about putting female ambassadors on trains to that have cultural competence and are able to diffuse and address like harassing, those types of issues. I think we have to have people there to support women in situations where they feel vulnerable. I think that's an important issue to tackle. And I think we need to really collect data. You mentioned the need for gender disaggregated data. And I think actually that goes, when I say gender, I mean we need to understand how it's different for how people identify their gender. I think we need to understand how travel is for trans women, women, older women, younger women, and really understand it as a, from an all race, all age, all abilities type of approach in order to really understand this emerging travel pattern change that we're seeing post-COVID and come up with solutions for it.
Yeah, it's hard to add because we're just so over-reliant on cars, and that has made it so difficult to create, communities or neighborhoods that are connected, and that disconnection drives a lot of the issues that we have, like societal issues. And so when I think about what isn't working, a lot of it is like this, connection issue, that we're not connected like physically with our infrastructure. We're not connected to our communities. We don't really know like who our neighbors are. That kind of creates like this separation from each other. It drives a lot of individualism, and it's really unhealthy, right? I always talk about Fiji because it was probably, I'm sure if you've ever met a Peace Corps volunteer, they always talk about Peace Corps. But I loved living there, and it wasn't really like a place that was planned the way that, like some of our cities here are planned. It is very much like a community-driven thing, and they do have like a highway system kind of, but they don't really over-rely on cars, and so people just walk places, and they don't really, like, they'll walk through, a lot of different things that I don't think that we would imagine walking through, but it's very common there. And I remember, like, even though spatially it was like not what I would expect to be, walking friendly, I never felt like that disconnect that I couldn't get somewhere because of it. There was buses, you could get anywhere by bus. I'm also from Mexico, and Mexico is the same way, where you could get on a bus and pretty much go anywhere. And so I think that connection piece is what's kind of missing sometimes in the US. It just really drives that disconnection and kind of creates all of these additional issues.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add to that. I think what I would add is kind of the next step is how do you get from these are the problems with transportation, these are the things that have changed recently with the pandemic, these are community building kinds of issues. How do you get from there to have people understand the vision for where to go next, and that it doesn't necessarily happen all at once, and building little pieces of better infrastructure and doing demonstration projects and those sorts of things may help to get people to see the vision of where we want to go.
Yeah, and I just want to add, just building on Ruth's comment about a connected society, I think we are all realizing the role that transportation infrastructure has also played in serving as barriers in communities. As we're probably all quite familiar with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the new federal grant program called Reconnecting Communities. I'll just plug MPC for a second. We just finished a report that we've titled Reconnecting Communities that is going to be released formally at a webinar on May 10th, so mark your calendars. But this whole concept of how transportation is, not only maybe not working, but sometimes its presence is dividing neighborhoods, the interstate highways, the railroads that cause all these physical barriers to communities, is a real issue that we're only recently recognizing in the United States. So that's part of the conversation, not only improving people's mobility, but also reducing the barriers that all this infrastructure has actually caused, dividing communities. So since you brought that up, I thought I would jump on that. And I guess I would also add one thing related to what Kim said is this idea of vision. We were saying when we were eating, how can we be building transportation for the places we want to live in? Are we building the places we want to live in? Or are we building places that a computer model told us that there would be this many cars in 30 years? I think we all know the struggles of that reality, but how can we operationalize more a human-centered view on transportation?
And what I said in response to that,
Yeah.
I think, was we're talking about building a bike lane in our community, and the models, of course, and the engineers say, well, we have to build for what the traffic is going to be like in 20 years. And I said, well, if you put the bike lane in, isn't there going to be less traffic? You know, and that's not part of the model. That doesn't get taken into consideration in any way.
Well, and it's important to note that those, like, you know, traffic forecasting and all of these things where we expand the width of our roadways to accommodate an ever-growing demand for travel by car has created a transportation network that is, you know, as soon as travel demand dropped during COVID, which is normally associated with reduced fatalities, we saw fatalities spike during the same time that our travel was reduced from stay-at-home orders and remote work. And I think everybody was like, wait, what is happening? We saw our highest number of fatalities in 2020 since 2007, and then I think in 21 it was since 2004 in this country and in this region. So the upward tick began prior to COVID in traffic fatalities in the United States, and it's worth noting that that did not happen in other countries. That's a United States problem. And you know, we realized that we have built an incredibly wide, straight, and flat transportation network, which is an appropriate approach for our highway system when you really want to accommodate fast-moving, long-distance travel. But the same principles that have informed our highway system design are the ones informing the roads in our neighborhoods and in our downtowns and in our central business districts. And we have a lot of high-speed, high-capacity roadways that are now not congested. So people are, you know, it's pretty much open season in terms of how fast you want to go on a lot of downtown streets. I see it when I'm personally walking to, you know, work, and the 3-lane road has no cars on it, so the one car that's driving on it is going 45 miles an hour in the loop. And that is a much different approach to road building than they do in Europe. Roads are designed to encourage the desired operating speeds in Europe, and that's a huge factor in the safety of walking and biking, and a very relevant topic to this idea for mobility for women. You know.
Yeah. So before we get into more talking about solutions, I just wanted to for a moment also think about kind of the future generations and children. And I know Ruth has worked for many years just prior to her current job with Lurie Children's Hospital, and she did a lot of walkability work in neighborhoods around the city. And I know, and Kim and Vickie are also moms. You know, tell us kind of what you learned about, you know, what the transportation system is, what's not working for children and the next generation.
Yeah, so some of the focus that we had at Lurie Children was this public health side, and there was, like, you know, different departments, one of them being injury prevention, and they tracked a lot the issues that were happening in transportation with children dying, and there were programs to address that. But a big thing that we saw is that in the healthcare system, there is not, like, a lot of attention to transportation. So when people get to their doctor, we don't know how they actually get there, and there's some people who miss their appointments because they don't have a transportation option to get there. So it is starting to change in the healthcare system, where they do ask, you know, parents or patients, like, do you have an issue getting to your doctor appointment? That is, like, a very new thing in the healthcare system, because that wasn't previously something that transportation wasn't really thought of in that way, even though it is one of the biggest barriers. And so I think when we think about, like, these different intersecting things happening, right, it's not just like, oh, well, it's healthcare and it lives in its own bubble, right? It's actually like people's lives. And in the healthcare system, they're also asking people like, are you food insecure? Because we know that these issues obviously affect our health, but like whether we're able to get healthcare. And so some of these things have been coming up, especially in a hospital like Lurie that is a nonprofit hospital and that provides healthcare to any child regardless whether they can pay or not. And so we have like a varying amount of patients, right, that have different experiences. And so I think because we had never really talked or addressed that, those things were missing, right? We weren't paying attention to the patients that were struggling and why their healthcare outcome or health outcomes don't improve, and it's because of all these things. So that's a big thing that is starting to change, but there's still not a lot of hospitals or healthcare systems that are paying attention to that. But hopefully, in the upcoming years, it will be.
Do either of you have anything you want to add about what's not working for children in the next generation?
Well, I just read this morning. In 2020, 607 children died in traffic crashes as passengers. It's the leading cause of childhood death under the age of 12. And, they're not the people that are choosing to be in a car, right? We all understand those are our lifestyles and to some extent might be required, but it is particularly poignant to note that that's the leading cause of death, I think, for children under the age of 12. Cars could be safer for children, that's true, but I think the less we're in cars and the less children are in cars, the better off they are. We know that, the more cars that descend on a school to do pickups and drop-offs, the more dangerous the traffic conditions are near those schools. And, the location of schools really matters. There's been a movement to consolidate schools, move them out of neighborhoods to outskirts of communities where they can be bigger and fancier, but it also removes the option of walking and biking to school for children, which is shown to improve cognition. It's been shown to improve attention. It improves like long-term school performance when they get physical activity prior to starting their school day. So transit's another thing that people are talking about more with children, especially as we think about post-COVID recovery, like ideas about whether or not we want to, really encourage transit use among school children, because we can give them perhaps passes through the school district and encourage like the next generation of transit riders when they're more likely to try new things, use technology to find a bus route and experiment. So it's an interesting opportunity that might be available for transit and children mobility.
I think putting children in cars all the time and having parents transport them here to there really impacts their ability to develop a sense of independence and to build their own communities with their peers. And I think that has become a big problem. I know there are a lot of colleges, for instance, have to do a lot more work to kind of calm parents down than they used to do because the kids just don't have that independence.
Yeah, my daughter is in college now, and she grew up walking to school and riding CTA to school, and we actually chose a college that was on a train line because like that's her lifestyle, and she couldn't imagine living without that autonomy and independence. But there aren't, that's not always prioritized.
It's also jobs that are not accessible to public transit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And more young people are not getting their license when they're 16, when they're 18,
Mm-hmm.
and lately even when they're 20. So those numbers are really changing, and we need to really start thinking about what the next phase of mobility looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's move into that kind of we've talked about some of the problems. Let's talk about kind of what do we think the solutions are to some of these problems moving forward. Anyone who wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, you asked me to talk about this, so I will mention.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to go to Barcelona recently, and they have a concept called the super blocks. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but this is something where they take I think it's a 3x3 block area, and they don't remove the streets, but they paint some of the streets. They put games and benches and planters and all sorts of things into the intersections. So they make it more difficult to drive in those areas and make it more friendly to people. So there are more people biking and walking. The restaurants and the shops have really been thriving in these areas, and property values have gone up because people want to be there. So that's, to me, a really interesting concept, and one that we may want to try out in the US.
Yeah, MPC has an archived webinar with someone from Barcelona explaining the whole concept. If you're interested, let me know. I could give you the link to tell you more. What other solutions should we be pursuing right now to overcome some of these challenges?
This is a really hard question, just because I think it's just so dependent on community, like, you know, different communities and different states and kind of what's happening there. But yeah, I always come back to the fact that, like, we don't, you know, live single issue lives. So it's not just like transportation people that are going to solve this. It's going to be like a coalition of people in different sectors coming together and actually talking to people across different fields to understand what is happening in people's lives. Because I don't think that we can do that alone in transportation, even though it is like such a connecting, you know, part of our lives. Every day you walk out your door, you are in the transportation system, but we're getting to places, right? We're going to school, we're going to the doctor, we're going to a grocery store, and all those things, right? Housing, those things need to be part of the conversations that we have, and actually talking to people in those fields, but also like people, like actually talking to people, because we can have a lot of statistics, but if we don't have like their stories, it doesn't really mean anything, right? We can have a bunch of numbers, and we're still going to be confused about what they mean and what they're actually telling us. So I do think that it's like a coalition building and actually talking to people on the ground that are experiencing the effects of the transportation system. There's been times where you know, when I was at Lurie, we would be working with a community, and a community member or two would be like, I don't know why they built, you know, this thing here. It could have been better two blocks down, because here nobody, and you know, we just spent all this money on infrastructure, and these community members are telling us nobody's going to use that because of all these issues, and it's because nobody consulted them, nobody talked to them. And so if we keep doing that, and if we keep like building without talking to people, without talking to community members, without, you know, like actual community engagement and coalition building, we're just going to continue doing, like, creating the same cycle. So I do think that one of the solutions is coalition building.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Intentionally engaging women in the conversations we're having about mobility and transit and corridor planning, you know, and that can mean thinking through public engagement events really carefully. Like, is childcare provided? Is food provided? You know, when are these meetings happening? What does it make sense for us to get the most cross-cutting representation of women, age, race, ethnicity, like all the needs that we have, and make sure that those are all represented really intentionally, because data is an important piece of the story, but what we all saw when you raised your hands at the beginning of this was the trips not taken because of perceived danger, and that could have been traffic safety danger, it could have been personal safety danger. But that's an issue that we didn't take that trip, and that trip never happened, and there's no data to show that we didn't take that trip. You only find out that piece of information when you talk with people about where are the most dangerous roads in your community, where is there lighting missing. I mean, lighting is an incredibly important safety piece for women in particular.
So many good ideas. I'm reflecting on the fact that transportation has been historically such a data-driven industry, and it still is. But I'm hearing you so much talk about engagement, consultation, qualitative data. There's just new appreciation for how important that is, and hearing women's stories in particular is part of that. So what do you think will be the consequences if we don't change the way we do things, if we don't prioritize thinking about women in how we design the future of our transportation system? What will happen?
I mean, a lot is changing right now with travel demand. I mean, I've been talking with colleagues this week about like what's happening right now with remote work and caregivers. You know, like are caregivers leveraging remote work more often because of demands related to taking care of parents and children and others. It's hard to say, but I do think there's a real opportunity to leverage that change. We know that women may not travel the same amount in a trip or in a year, so like in other words, not as far a distance, but more trips. So, and that's still true even post-COVID. And sometimes we've seen that remote work actually generates more trips than a commute trip would into a downtown area. So I'd say right now there's an opportunity for us to really learn more about how people are traveling in general and what that means for women. I mean, the pay gap and all of the issues that women face in the workplace, I think, are at risk if we don't start to solve for mobility in a new and better way. I think some of those really intractable issues will just persist and maybe get worse if we don't address this issue now. I think there's also an opportunity for us to leverage this like short local trips option that many women are looking at with solutions like improved mobility for bicyclists and fixing sidewalk gaps and that kind of thing, so that those shorter local trips can be done on foot, on bike, and accessing transit.
I also want to hear from Ruth and Kim, but once we've had their answers, I want you to think about questions that you have, because we're going to move to Q&A. So start thinking about questions you have that you'd like to ask the panel. And then Ruth.
Yeah, so is that on? Okay, sorry. I can never tell. So, I mean, if we don't find the solutions, people are just going to keep dying, and it's pretty much going to fall on the most marginalized people. That's what we see over and over. People who die, like pedestrians who die, a great majority of them, especially in Chicago, are Black residents. And I think that a lot of times people don't recognize that we are just killing the most marginalized people in our communities. People get killed in low-income communities often, and we don't pay attention to it. And I think it's like a really harsh reality that these things are happening. I almost got hit by a car when I was like biking over here, and I was just like, it's interesting to me that we don't think about, like, we know that guns kill people, but we don't think about cars killing people, and they do every day. And I think that that is like something that as we are designing our cities, our roads, we have to be thinking about that, right? And it's like, how do we stop that from happening? How do we make sure that the most marginalized aren't like the ones bearing the brunt of it? And I do think about climate change. Like, climate change will continue to get worse if transportation continues on this path. And again, it's going to fall on the most marginalized people, because we know that that's what happens. And as we heard, women carry a big burden of climate change. And so I definitely saw that in Fiji, where like it's not even that there's cars, but not everybody has a car the way that, like, maybe in the US, many people have cars or multiple cars, and they are facing climate change. So we are burdening them with that was our responsibility. That's what we did. And I just think about the injustice in that. And so I think that if we don't figure it out, and if we continue doing the things that we're doing, people are going to continue dying. It might be one of our family members. It might be, people we love. And it's definitely going to be marginalized people.
I think that's all of it. I think it's covered.
I think you nailed it. Unfortunately, that's very sobering. Okay, so now let's turn it to the audience and see what thoughts and questions you have about how we can consider women's needs better as we are designing and building and operating our transportation systems. We have very experienced folks up here who have a lot of knowledge. So what questions do you have, or what issues are coming up for you? Right there, yeah. Oh, you're. I'll repeat the question. How can we reach out to women in communities to do better engagement and ask them what they need?
I'd say more and more we are seeing success with going to places where people are already gathering. We know that people are busy, women are busy, and finding a spot where an event is already occurring has been a fairly successful way of meeting people where they are. And sometimes, you know, when we do like some of our safety engagement events, it's at some kind of festival that the cities or towns are hosting, and we have a table and we can engage directly with people. And children, that's actually a really great strategy, is if you can find public engagement strategies that bring children's voices, they are often followed by their caregivers' voices. So you kind of get a twofer on that. That's been a good strategy.
So at America Walks, we do create a lot of resources for communities to access. So we have like the walking college, where we get people that are just residents that either are kind of already advocates or want to be, and we host it nationally and in a different states. Illinois doesn't have one, but we basically teach people how to become advocates, so we give them a lot of tools, and part of it is teaching them the language of transportation planners and engineers, because I think sometimes when people don't have that language, we dismiss them or we don't pay attention to them, and so we try to equip them with that knowledge. But another big thing is like trying to provide the resources of community engagement to engineers and planners and people that are making these decisions, so that they know what is happening to the community members, in their communities. And I think another way to, engage, I think that's a great idea, like going where people already are. And also there's like a lot of neighborhood-based organizations that already have contact with, residents in their communities, and they know issues really well. So it's also partnering with them. I think that, in Chicago, where we've done a lot of that work, there's people, here that work on community engagement with the Department of Transportation. And so I think like doing that kind of work, like having those people and connecting with them is a really important part of community engagement.
There's so much information that is out in the world now between social media and all these different sources, which may or may not be correct. And so trying to get information to people has become more difficult, because you have to sort through what's out there. So I think going to people where they are and providing information through the already trusted sources, through schools, through child care centers, through community-based organizations, is a really good way to get input and engagement.
Those are great answers. Another question?
Hi, my name is Olivia Ortega. I work for a micro-mobility company, so we sell stand-up scooters, seated scooters, e-bikes, pedal bikes, and deploy them in communities around the country. So a big part of my role is working with local government and local communities to talk about how they can, design policies and local infrastructure that helps micro-mobility be like safe and accessible and reliable option for
opportunity to measure
Yeah.
my bike lane.
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
We have been trying to get a bike lane on a arterial road in our community for a while. The road is going to be reconstructed anyway. There's sewer and water underground work to be done and resurfacing. So this is the opportunity to put a bike lane in. But we've had a lot of people who have said, well, if you put a bike lane in, more people are going to bike on that road. It's going to be less safe for everybody, which is exactly contrary to what the data says. And when I present the data, because I'm an elected official, not a staff member or a consultant, nobody believes me. So that's been a challenge. I don't know, other than trying to get accurate information to local elected officials to understand that, one crash is not necessarily the end to these things. We have to figure out how to make the roads safe for everybody. We have to have complete streets policies. We have to put in place appropriate infrastructure so that everyone is safe. And we shouldn't be dictating what mode of transportation they choose to use. We just have to make the streets safe for everybody. And we have to make it less car-centric.
I don't know what kind of community this is exactly, but I do know that in some communities, I know that, I'm Mexican. In my culture, a way that you signify success is by having a car, right? We see riding public transportation, walking, biking as a sign of not having wealth. It happens, and it's not just in my community, it's in a lot of communities. And so sometimes people have ideas that, that is like not a good thing for those things to be in our communities. There's also the aspect of gentrification. If you build like a bike lane, then it will gentrify the area, and that has also happened. And so I think those are some of the issues that actually need to be addressed with the community before trying to do something like that, depending on what kind of community it is, because there are a lot of layers of societal things that we have imposed on people that people have it's car-centric because people have that thinking because it was pushed on people, right? And so now trying to get them out of it is really, really difficult, and we don't want to penalize them for it, but these are parts of the culture that exist. And so we can't just be well, you're gonna get it, and even if you don't like it, because people aren't going to like it. And there will be backlash. It has happened in Chicago in communities when people have put down things that people don't want. And we also have to take into account does this community, how much are they using micromobility, and do they live really far away from work? Why are they, what is the actual story here? What is what's happening that's creating that? I think if we don't answer that question, then we risk that backlash, being quite detrimental, and then people will be even more against it. And so I think I see that happening often, especially because I am I bike and walk. I don't have a car. I haven't had a car in a long time, but I see it a lot with cyclists where we got to put bike lanes everywhere, and that they have tried that in the communities that I've lived in, and people have been very mad. They've not been happy because you remove parking away from them, and they're I can't take micromobility to work. I work 30 miles away, right? So those are the concerns that we do actually have to listen to. So I do, again, community engagement, really need to get to the core of what the issue is.
And I would add that accident, the crash that you just talked about, is there's a shift in thinking about safety right now that's going from this kind of the ease of safety, which was creating silos. I won't go into my whole spiel about how safety is changing, but there's a new approach to it called the safe system approach, and it is being heavily advertised and funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And one of the key features about it is redundancy in our transportation system so that one mistake does not result in a fatal crash. So if that micromobility user had had a protected lane, an impaired driver would have not been able to cross into wherever they were. And those types of systemic changes that create redundancies to prevent fatalities, they won't prevent all crashes, but it will prevent people from dying as a result of a crash, are being fully funded by our federal government right now in a way that's never been done before. So if you want to talk about the Safe Streets and Roads for All, I'm available after.
Yeah, in the back.
Well, there are people in the audience here who know more about this than me. I'm looking at you, Tom. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in figuring out transit right now. It is time, and this is one of the, our agencies working on this right now, is kind of like rethinking what regional transit looks like going forward with these changing travel patterns, a new financial reality for transit as it exists today. What system do we need? What system do we want? How do we pay for it and make it serve people in this like emerging change that we're still kind of observing post-pandemic with more remote work and you know, more trips happening in the afternoon than in the morning, and some just interesting changes that we're trying to understand and also accommodate with transit. So there's no quick and easy answer to the transit problem right now, but a lot of people are doing some big thinking about it because there's a funding issue coming forward in about 2025 with a lot of the legacy transit systems and not having enough ridership to pay for operations. So there's a lot of big thinking going on and on that topic.
Yeah, but all of us need to be prepared to be voices in support of possibly hard decisions that our legislators are going to have to make to fund our transit system. So get ready to use your voice in the next 2 years. I saw another hand. Yes, go ahead. And maybe Ruth, you want to talk a little bit about what America Walks does to try to change culture.
Yeah, so we have a few campaigns that we're working on right now. One of them is decriminalizing jaywalking, because we know, again, penalizing, communities of color often, and kind of creating that interaction with police that can result in the death of residents. And so that's one way. There's like a whole coalition, national coalition, to try to get this done across cities. We're working on reconnecting communities with the Freedom Fighters Network, and so this is like the federal funding to remove highways and connect communities, again, affecting marginalized communities often. And then I'm working on a week without driving. So this is it was started by disability rights in Washington, state of Washington, and their focus is on getting elected officials to do a week without driving, with the perspective it's not a bike to work week or a walk to work week, but it's actually thinking about the barriers that exist when you are getting to work or to the places that you need to for a week, with the accessibility, and disability rights understanding. And so we are going to be starting and working on that. And we have like a few other things. You can follow us, on social media. And we also host webinars. We just had a webinar on Tuesday. It was about intelligence. Oh my gosh. This is not my area, but basically it's like the safety cameras that like will slow cars down so that they don't speed, and it's like instead of enforcement and like I don't know if you want.
I believe it's called Intelligent Speed Assist.
There we go. Yeah.
And I was going to plug America Walks. It's a resource. It's a wonderful organization with amazing resources and educational webinars. It's one that I follow closely for really leading edge thinking on the topic, so double that.
Yeah, and we're just back to culture change. So much of it starts at the top with trustees like Kim, who are leading the way, trying to change the culture in her community. And I think we need to think about this as something in every community, not just the city of Chicago, but all the suburban communities. MPC has worked with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, and we've done a series of webinars targeting elected officials to help them understand why they should have bicycle and pedestrian plans, why they should be doing transit-oriented development, why they need to be doing accessibility plans. And then there are also campaigns there's a campaign called Move with the Mayor that some mayors do. They do huge efforts in the suburbs or anywhere where they sign on and commit to do community-based activities with their residents and for a week, or go on a group walk with the mayor. So, all of us can play a role in trying to change the culture in our communities wherever we live.
But you don't need to wait for an event.
No.
You can always contact your elected officials, and especially local ones. Usually our email addresses are on the websites, and you can reach out directly with information and ideas. And I would hope that you would, or run for office.
Yeah, the more the elected officials hear from residents that are putting pressure on the communities to make change, the easier it is for them to make, if Kim had 100 people protesting in favor of bike lanes in front of City Hall, it might be easier for her to get this bike lane where it's on a Needles, it's not, she's not sure she's even going to get it approved. And it's a real struggle for her. So how can we help by speaking up more? We're professionals, but we're also residents, and we can also be communicating with our neighbors in our communities. Yeah.
That sounded like a WTS call to action.
Well, an exercise that MPC's been doing in partnership with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus is we've been documenting every municipality in the entire region. Do they have a pedestrian or bicycle plan? Do they have a complete streets policy? Do they have a bicycle and pedestrian committee? So at the elected official level, many suburban communities will have, they have city council, but then they might also have a transportation committee that is advisory. They might have a bicycle and pedestrian committee that's advisory, but that's the minority. So understanding having the right bodies to actually do the research, be informed, and then actually change the municipality's policy is sort of something we're looking at. How do we create those structures where that leadership can exist and start to move these policies? How are we doing on time? Just wrap it up? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Enjoy your pink cake. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you to the panel.